It's a good day to be indigenous.
This is Breakdances with Wolves, Indigenous Pirate Radio.
Nope, I got nothing.
You got nothing?
Why? Why don't I have nothing? Why do I have nothing?
Because you're honoring Whitney Houston right now.
Oh, that too. But we're also honoring Wesley B. Roach.
Yes. Shout out to Wesley B. Roach. Big moment in his family. I'm not going to put his business out there, but it's a big moment in the family, and it's really, really cool. This is Breakdance Wolves Indigenous Pirate Radio. My name is Jossie Ross Natanako Unagumsika. I come from the Blackfeet people, those tall, handsome, and modest people from the Northern Plains, directly south of the Canadian border, what's now known as Canadian border, directly east of what is now known as Glacier National Park, one of the most beautiful places in the whole entire world. I'm sitting here with some of my favorite people in the world. Please introduce yourself.
I am Miss Long Earth, and I am the co-host of Breakdances with Wolves Indigenous Pirate Radio. I'm a Southeasterner, those suspiciously incredibly short Native people, and but yet nonetheless good looking. So I, pretty much, and I have grandmothers and grandfathers from other places as well, which include West Africa and through the West Indies and through the Deep South, but also from Ireland and Scotland. And so we have a guest.
Hi, everybody. Patrisse Cullors here. I'm so grateful to be with y'all. We've been trying to do this for a minute.
Long time.
Like literally years. And I'm so glad we're doing it now. Co-founder of Black Lives Matter, born and raised here in Los Angeles, California, and just a lot of deep, deep gratitude to be in conversation with both of you.
Thank you so much. I know that this is an incredibly, incredibly busy time for you. I know it's an incredible time of destroy and rebuild, which, that's the cycle of life, right? That's something that has been shown over and over, whether we're talking about slash and burn forests, we slash them down. That was actually a native practice. There was a chief named Oshkosh from the Menominee people. And, he said, this is how you do it. And there's a real cool story that goes behind it. And and people for lots of years scoffed at that notion. Oh no, this is, old primitive native practices. You're not supposed to be doing that. And then at some point people realized, oh, you know what? This works. If we start where the sun rises and cut down those portions of forest and move westward toward where the sun sets, and we do that and we give proper time for rebuilding, proper time for repairing, proper time for revitalization, it's sustainable. And it's something that it just makes so much sense. And I see that time happening right now. And it's scary. It's scary because, we know the evil that we know, and we're comfortable with the evil that we know, and we've been comfortable with it for a very long time. And then we get confronted with these new storytellers, Patrisse, other people who are telling a story that is something different than just accepting the evil that we know. It's a completely different story. It's a completely different paradigm. And those new stories are oftentimes, terrifying. I'm sure that the first time somebody talked about, domesticating large mammals, that was terrifying to some people. Oh my gosh, that's a beast. That's a mythic creature. And then people realize, no, we can actually, work together with these large creatures. We can actually domesticate them. We can actually have a relationship with them. And now for our people, the Blackfeet people, the Amskapi Pukani people, we're some of the greatest horsemen in the world, greatest horsemen and women. And that came as a result of a relationship and telling new stories. And so I say all that, but with gratitude. Thank you so much for forcing us to listen to a new story. Thank you so much for being brave enough to tell a new story. And I would like to, open it up just, before we get into the questions and answers. tell a little bit about your story and what this larger narrative is happening right now and how we're living in this, apocalyptic / Afrofuturism / indigenous futurism time that has been way overdue.
Oh, I love that. And I love kind of just starting with the grounding of the earth and how we relate to the earth. And I think we forget, human beings often forget that we are nature. We're not separate from it. And it's our duty really to help align the planet, both in its relationship to other human beings, but also our human beings' relationship to the earth. So, for me, I grew up here in Los Angeles. LA is big, 10 million people, the county. I mostly grew up in a neighborhood called Van Nuys, families from like Coima, Lake Buterres, so the San Fernando Valley, and spent a lot of my life witnessing over-policing, over-incarceration, a significant amount of violence inside the neighborhood, inside the community, and very little support, very little care, very little resources. And I think that, that really shaped me, that shaped how I understood what we deserved. I think what was critical for me, though, is that I was labeled, quote, gifted at a young age and was shipped off to mostly white schools and white communities. And in that, really did see a completely different world, like the other side of the train track was so real. And I would show up to school and there would be no police. There would be, there was no punishment. There was no real chaos. It was a lot of support, a lot of infrastructure. And then I would walk or take the bus home and sort of like witness that like division the minute I entered into my neighborhood. In fact, I remember bringing a friend home with me once and him saying grudgingly, I didn't know you lived like this. And so those early experiences shaped who I would become and the work I wanted to do. I wanted to change the system. I knew that. I didn't know that language, but I knew it in my spirit. I knew it in my body that, why it's not fair. It's not fair that this other community for no real reason, was receiving all of these resources and my community wasn't. I wasn't the kind of kid that was like, I want to get out the hood. I never had that mentality. I was always like, I want to fix what's happening in my neighborhood. I want to fix it. I want to stay in the hood. I loved my neighborhood. I loved the people in my neighborhood. We just didn't have shit. And so I wanted to change those conditions. And that obviously would shape me and would make me end up being a full-time community organizer and activist and now, movement leader.
Thank you very much for that synopsis. And movement leader / narrative changer. And, I find that narrative is a word that's way overused nowadays because, people, it's like they make it small, right? Narrative, we're talking big, talking story arcs. And this is a time where story arcs are profoundly changing. They're changing. And it's requiring masterful storytellers. And when I see, up here in Seattle, they've been turning up. And I see these young folks and I realize, they're not getting credit for the geniuses they are. They're masterful storytellers. I like, for me personally, I want to hand this over to Minty because I actually envision this conversation as being a conversation between y'all for the most part. I have a couple questions, but Minty is the structure, the backbone of our show. And, I really want to do that. But I just, I just want to make an admission because when I see you, and one of the reasons why the first time I met you, Patrisse, I gave you a big hug and I just said, thank you, if you recall it. And the reason why is because you see me, I got my shirt on right now. I got court tomorrow and stuff like that. And I'm a lawyer. And for so long, I played according to the white people's rules. That I thought that there was a specific protocol if you wanted to make change. Like you go to school, you learn to speak like them, you learn to write like them. You know, if you do all that stuff, you become an honorary white person. And pretty soon, you know, around the age of 50, 55, they start to take you seriously. And then maybe you can make some small incremental change. And y'all just completely changed that shit around. Like, you know, and it was, and I didn't take it. I don't get defensive about stuff like that. I think it's beautiful. You know, I saw it and I was like, oh, okay, that's dope storytelling. Because I was actually living somebody else's story. You know, I was doing what somebody else said, this is the script. And when I see, again, to the young folks that are turning up, when I see you, when I see anybody that's involved in just serious seismic, violent change. And when I say violent, I'm not talking about tactics. I'm talking about it's jarring. Because we're so used to these tiny symbolic, like Derek Bell was talking about, these things that really don't have any value. And that's what I was participating in. And I don't mind admitting that. That's not me being, you know, self-deprecating. That's just truth. And I see y'all, and the storytelling is so beautiful, and it's so deep, and it shakes us at a seismic level down to the very core, the magma of who we are. And that's just beautiful. And that's the reason why when I saw you, I just had to say thanks, because, man, the storytelling is incredible. Minty, I'm sorry I rambled a little bit too long. I'm going to butt out for a while. So my big sister, one of the loves of my life, who's just an amazing person, been an inspiration and a mentor to me, Patrisse, I invite you to talk to Minty for a little while.
Yay. Well, you know, I think as a woman, as a BIPOC woman, I gotta just know, how are you doing? How is your heart?
Well, thank you for that. Every day is different. I think, you know, this time around, I feel much more grounded. You don't know what you don't know. So, you know, 7 years ago when we started BLM, I didn't realize what that was going to do, how it was going to change my life and the world. And so this time around, I was like, oh, okay, I kind of know how this works. Got to know what I need in place. I know that it's going to be intense for several months, you know, and then I know that cameras are going to leave and we're going to have to keep it up. So this time around, I feel like I have way more infrastructure for my own, for my body and my spirit and my mind and my presence. I also have a kid this time around. I was pregnant during the first iteration of BLM. And I think having a 4-year-old has really grounded me in a way that's really different. Like I have to my discernment is just like on point, you know, where I'm like, okay, yes, this works. Okay, no, I can't do that. Like, this is what I can give. This is how much of myself I can give. So every day is different though. Today I'm a little tired, but I feel like very grateful. There's just a well of gratitude often.
Yeah. How has your, back then and now, how has your perception of a support network looked? How does it change? What does it look like that's different now?
I think, you know, I think back then, even the people around me didn't really know what to do. You know, I think people were like, we've read this type of stuff in books, but like, what does it actually mean to be supportive? You know, I lost a lot of my friendships. I've regained them, but there was just a lot of, you know, people felt resentful. People felt hurt or upset because they didn't fully get, like, in some ways I was being a soldier for the movement and I kind of had to do my duty. And it meant that I couldn't be in the kinds of relationships that I was in before. So this time around, I feel like I also have, like, we've all grown so much. I have a really tight knit community. And so when everything popped off this time, like, they got in formation in a real way. They're like, all right, here's your care team. Here's your, you know, your security team. And my crew really organically got information and learned from the past. So I have a tremendous amount of support and ways that I didn't have before. I felt very isolated when we first started BLM, and while like the world was thanking us, and we were being interviewed, and people were giving us a lot of like accolades, that it was very lonely. It was a very lonely experience. There was a lot of traveling alone and being in hotels alone, and very little sort of relationship building. And I'm someone who really, I need relationships. Like, they're really important to me, friendships and community. And so this time around, I feel so different. Like, I feel like I have kept that at the core of my work.
Yeah. I lived here and in Pomona and Fontana as a kid, growing up in Fontana and Pomona, specifically the Pomona-San Dimas area. And when I moved from here, I had a really strong urban Native community. And I moved down there, and it was like culture shock, right? There was nobody that was Native. And if they were Native, they were not like Native like us up here. It was just a totally different experience. And what I found really quickly was that I didn't have permission to be both. And then having the added mixture of white, I also was transracially adopted. So then there was this added layer of like, and you have that, right? And then my sister is Korean, and you have that. So there were all these like intersections that didn't always intersect the way that I hoped they would. And now we're in this revolution, right? And I think you're a year younger than my daughter. Maybe you're the same age as my daughter. And you are literally like in rap lyrics. You are literally like going to be that ancestor. People are like, yo, no, I descend from her. And I know, like most people, you didn't set out and go, I think I will be a game changer entirely. I think that's how I'll live. But you've done that, and you're standing with other people who've done that. And I'm so curious now that you are exposed to people that weren't part of, Pacoima, weren't part of Van Nuys, weren't part of communities as Indigenous people that actually had visibility and community. You now have this larger community that considers you family and claims you and loves you. How do you see what is happening in Indian country and the movements that need to happen there and Black Lives Matter? How do you see them intersecting, and how do you see them not intersecting?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this. I think about this question a lot. There's Giassi and I talk about this a lot. But so many Black Americans, there's a deep, I don't want to call it myth because I don't want to offend anybody, but there's a deep sort of like legacy of us saying that we got Indian in our family. But what I think that actually means is there's like a deep desire and also a deep understanding that there is a intrinsic solidarity that exists in our communities that we don't often tap into. And I know that, when we were invited, Black Lives Matter Standing Rock, that was one of the first times, I think, in our movement where we were having a different kind of conversation about indigeneity, and a different kind of conversation about Turtle Island and like what relationship we had and what was our relationships going to be like. And I think that, my desire and my, I think, challenge to us as two communities that have been devastated by colonization is that there's more room to actually engage in how we show up or don't show up for each other. And as someone who lives here in Los Angeles, who spent a lot of time in Latinx communities and have had a lot of conversations around Black and Brown relationships in particular, there is this kind of rigor that is needed in order to step into the ring of conversations with a different community than yours that has been oppressed by the same government. And I think that conversation takes courage. I think it takes a kind of vulnerability. I think it takes the willingness to make mistakes and to possibly hurt each other. And I think it takes a road coming back to one another. And so, with that said, I think there's more that needs to be done when it comes to Black folks and Native folks. I think there's not just the kind of dialogue that needs to happen between our communities, but there are so many connections that could be made around police terror and police brutality, around mental health in our communities, but also, and maybe more importantly, our resilience, the resilience that comes out of our communities that we just don't tap into. And I think it has a lot to do with the proximity. I think it has a lot to do with, the ways in which the U.S., has this white supremacy has a kind of fetishization with all of our different communities in different ways. And so there is a way in which Black communities are sort of hyper visibilized in all the wrong ways and all the quote right ways that really confuse, I think, even our community around what does solidarity look like with other communities. So I feel like I'm interested in going beyond conversations, although conversations are necessary, and really recognizing like I'm an organizer, so I'm always thinking about like what's the narrative shift that needs to happen, but also what is the, for lack of a better word, like legislative shift or systemic shift that needs to happen that actually brings our communities together. Like I'm deeply interested in that. And I'll close with this. I when I first started organizing, I was in a multiracial organization, and it was kind of our job as a multiracial organization to study each of the main groups that we were really fighting for, and to figure out how we were in relationship to one another and what did that solidarity look like. And in Los Angeles, there's a big Korean community. I think it's the largest Korean community outside of Korea. And so we were attempting to have a multiracial movement with a Korean community that has a history of a lot of racism towards Black people in particular. And so we would do these cultural exchanges around Black folks learning about Korean folks and Korean folks learning about Black folks, and not in sort of like that Sesame Street kind of way, although I love Sesame Street, but like real deep engagement about our people's struggles and histories and how we got to the place we got to, and the very hard conversations about anti-Black racism or anti-Asian sentiment. And that's the way I learned how to be in community. At the end of the day, if we're going to be on land that was stolen, how are we going to be with the community that the land was stolen from? And that, to me, it feels very critical. And it's something that I think we just haven't gotten there yet. And this iteration of our movement, because there's a long history of deep relationships between Black and Natives. But I think this iteration of our movement, there's been moments, but there hasn't been a sustained movement.
Yeah, so I had a couple of specific questions, Patrisse. Because, I think I've actually been very proud. I'm somebody that, in our show, and just generally, we have 3 Native people who also have African ancestry, on our show. Randy Tippin's first writer, he's not here. But, he does as well. And both, all of us are very, hopefully, we're immersed in all of it. Don't really do the binary thing as far as race, or if there is race, right? And so we speak a lot in very first person terms about some of the ways that historically anti-Blackness within Native communities has affected us and affected other people. And not in a way that's glossy or perfunctory or conclusory, but like, no, this is real life. This is actually how it's shown up. So with that caveat, I've been very proud of the way Native people have been respectful of this most recent incarnation of both the Black Lives Matter movement and just generally, because I don't think they're synonymous. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but also just generally the struggle for Black lives. I think those are sometimes two separate things, right? There's people who strive in other ways outside of Black Lives Matter as an organization or as a movement and say, well, this is my way. And I've been proud of the way Native people have, like, in my estimation, held off trying to put those concerns at the forefront, because sometimes it actually gets to this competitive thing, and it's really ugly. It's really self-defeating, and it's not good. So I want to be the voice box for all those people who have been very, very respectful and who have seen the bigger picture and said, you know what? Black people have 100% created this momentum for this most recent round of racial progress. So I think that there's a lot of people right now who, I'm representing a family in a case. It's called, the guy's name was Stonechild Chiefstick. And he's actually somebody I've known for a long time. I know his family. I was texting with his family earlier today. Not about this conversation, just because that's what I do. My kids play with their kids. And they've been extremely respectful. Like, we don't want to conflate or ride the coattails of Black Lives Matter, of the many Black folks who have been killed, harmed, incarcerated by law enforcement, and like, that's something that we have to respect. But I also, like, I see it in their eyes and I hear it in their voice. Like, they want to say things like this, and I'm going to give you a couple of things. Like, is it okay? Is it appropriation? Is it manipulative to say things like Native Lives Matter? Is it appropriation or something else? I don't know the separation between appropriation and influence and stuff like that. But is it any of those things? Is it bad, essentially, to put forth the very real fact patterns that contribute to our oppression and oftentimes death and oftentimes dismemberment and injury and incarceration at the hands of law enforcement? Are we stepping on people's feet who created this movement? I don't want to do that, but I also want to advocate for my family or for my friends or for my community. And so I wanted to confront that question because, I want them to feel, to hear, I suppose, like, what your thoughts are on that, of, if they're being unintentionally offensive or manipulative or something. And so I wanted to ask you about that, Patrisse.
Yeah, I love that question. I mean, I think part of this work, and as someone who really looked to the work of the Panther Party or the Brown Berets, and really saw that work, the work of fighting for folks' nations, there was the nationhood as they called it, in the 60s and 70s. I do think there's a power in saying, like, I stand in solidarity with, this movement, and I recognize how colonialism, white supremacy, anti-Black racism impacts my community too, even if our community isn't Black. The case here in Compton, Andres Guardado, who was killed by the sheriff. He was running, running from the sheriffs. He was a security guard. He was at work when he was killed. And the family, the family has obviously, took to the streets. And one of the first things they did was really thanked Black Lives Matter for being able to create an opening so the issue of police terror is an actual issue that people are looking at. There would be no national news of Andres if there wasn't a BLM. And so I think it's not about, waiting or being quiet while BLM or Black people sort of like fight this fight. I think this is the opportunity, and we saw it in the 60s and 70s with multiple groups, multiple nations standing up and saying, this is how the white man impacts my family. This is how the white man impacts my family. And some of that is overlap, and some of that is very specific to our communities. And I think it's this is a moment where we get to opportunities for all of us to rise up collectively and name that and say, yeah, like, sure, Black people may have started this iteration, of created a space for this, but we're not creating the space just for Black people. We're creating the space for folks who are under attack by this government to have a fuller conversation around what that attack looks like. And not to be like, we all need to unite, and do it together the same way. That's not possible. That doesn't even make sense. I'm not impacted by the US-Mexico borders personally. I'm not impacted by, a detention center personally, but I know that I have to fight alongside the folks who are impacted by racist and xenophobic immigration. So that to me is like where I think that's where that dialogue and that like those kinds of conversations around what we're fighting for and how we're fighting for it, and what are those specificities? What do they look like? What do they feel like? And how do we show up for each other? I want to make sure that the people in our movement are able to talk about Black people around the globe. I don't want to just be talking about Black people in the United States. I want to talk about Black people around the world and how anti-Black racism impacts all of us on the global front. I don't think it does us any service to be navel gazing. And when we say Black Lives Matter, it's an expansive term. It's not a limiting term. It's a term that's deeply expansive, and that is like getting straight to the gut of white supremacy. And I hope that communities feel it as a call to action for them too, to see how anti-Black racism. I believe anti-Black racism impacts all of us differently, but it impacts all of us.
I thank you very much for that. That's incredibly empowering and powerful, just as a statement. I actually take it like I'm actually glad when I see people being cautious, just for my and the reason why is because there's such a horrible history of everybody, not just white people, profiting off Black labor, right? And so I actually see it when I see Native people doing that and being cautious and being respectful. I'm like, all right, this is cool. And now we can get to the other side of the analysis, which is what you brought up, the conversation, the dialogue. Well, let's ask some questions. So thank you very much for that.
For sure.
And it feels sort of like there's a shift generationally. I'm Jossie and I talk about what I like about breakdance is that we span 3 to 4 generations, 4. And so a lot of the perspective is broadened. And I remember when BLM first became like trending, right? And I was, I'm gonna be 52, and I was like, "Shut up, Jossie." And Jossie mentioned where I knew I had to catch up immediately, and I've been working anti-racism for 25 years, and you never, like you said, you don't know what you don't know, but with anti-racism work, everybody realizes immediately this will never stop being a constant learning, right? And when you have to catch up quickly on something this revolutionary, it's also very difficult. If it were easy for us to grasp the concepts, we wouldn't be here. And so I remember being in a room, hearing people kind of go, well, Natives' lives matter too, all lives matter, blah, blah, blah. And I remember having to really kind of unpack a lot of white supremacy notions that I had internalized as to why I was like trying to understand how to center Blackness when I had constantly been raised in an environment to not center Blackness. How much discomfort it caused to own how easily that had been a conditioning, right? And so I now look at folks that I love and respect that are still grappling with that concept years later, right? Their catch up is taking a little while. How do you recommend when when people are trying to figure out how to bind their liberation? How do we even get to that point? Where is the starting point for those conversations? And because you'll hear the things like, how do you get 40 acres and a mule and stolen land in the same conversation?
Oof. Tell the whole truth. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question, to be quite honest with you, because it's really, in some ways, I feel like that's the question of the future. Like we haven't gotten to that place yet where we can have that conversation in a way that is generative, but I think it's the question we should be asking. I think a lot about, I don't know if y'all are following this because it's here in LA, but there's Manhattan Beach, which is a beach community. And there used to be several lots owned by a Black family. It was called Bruce's Beach. And essentially, white supremacist, in multiple ways. There's 2, KKK incidences where they ran out Black people, but then ultimately the white city council called that land eminent domain and then stole it from the Bruce family. And so in this George Floyd moment, there has been this reclaiming of that beach. And I've been thinking a lot about it. I haven't actually talked about it publicly, but thinking a lot about like the indigenous community that land was stolen from and like what that conversation looks like. And in some ways, I feel like we focus so much on whiteness and like how we reclaim our everything from the white people who stole it from us, that we don't often get to just like sit with each other and be like, okay, what would it look like to get this land back, and how do we negotiate with one another? And when I say we, I mean Black and Native people, and so it feels like a future conversation or a future question that we should actually be asking now. It's the way that BLM was like of the future when it came to us, It was a very provocative term. It was a very scary term. It was a very fulfilling term. Never in my wildest dreams did I think I would turn on Netflix and see Black Lives Matter on the screen, or Amazon, or YouTube commercials, like I never thought the corporatization of Black Lives Matter would happen. But that's when you go on to the next term, which is defund the police for us, right? Which they're hella scared of. But all that to say is those future questions or those future conversations, we should be posing them now. And I think, I remember in my sort of like, when I first started doing movement work and I was sitting in the rooms that were discussing reparations, there was always one or two Black elders in the space that would be like, if we're going to talk about reparations, we have to also talk about Black people's relationship to Native folks. But the conversation never sort of expanded past that. But I think those are the kinds of conversations that I feel like if we just were in if we were in proximity to each other more often, that we'd have more answers to those questions. Like, to me, one of the first things the Bruce's family, or even the people who are advocating for Bruce's Beach as they're trying to get the land back, is like, okay, how do we track down the team of folks whose land this is? Like, do they still live in Manhattan Beach? Have they been completely kicked out? I know for Bruce's family, that was 95 years ago, and they were kicked out of the land was stolen from them. They were kicked out of it, and then they went and were cooks for the next several years for a white community, and never received compensation. And now, I was just over there the other day because we're going to be doing an event over there, and I called, there's real estate, 2-story, a townhouse. And I called and asked how much the townhouse was. And for one of the townhouses, it was $5 million. So knowing that the land that we were on, was stolen from them and then rebuilt. Some of it is parkland and some of it is real estate. And it's probably worth hundreds of millions of dollars, overseeing the ocean. And what do you do with that? What do you do with that information? And who's responsible? Who's responsible for making sure that the family gets it? Who's responsible for the conversations around, Native folks? I think that it's such an interesting and important, it's an interesting tension that I'm curious about us leaning into as we further the conversations about land and reparations and reclaiming.
I think it's really interesting because I think people who are very familiar with living in Southern California that didn't know this story are probably shocked listening to this, because when I was a teenager, everybody ditched. If you lived in the Inland Empire, that's what you did. Which beaches to go to, and you knew which beaches you were not going to.
Mm-hmm.
None of us were going to hang out at Seal Beach, Manhattan Beach.
That's right.
You knew you could go to San Juan, but you weren't deviating and going to Manhattan. But the white boys that I went to high school with at San Dimas, they were going to Manhattan Beach.
Absolutely.
They were living their best Caucasian.
Mm-hmm.
So I think people need to also understand, this is if you're in New York trying to have the conversation about Manhattan Island. Manhattan Beach and Manhattan Island are pretty much the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's really an interesting conversation, but I also think it then opens the door for what has happened in so many towns in California, in the, to Black and brown and indigenous people. We got to open up, Truckee and Tulare and all these other places that really have some horrible stories around them. And we do need to start talking about that. If people are going to want change, what are you willing to give up? Because none of this is going to happen without us all having to give up a significant amount of what we think we should have access to or rights to.
That's right. That's right.
Jossie, I know you had a question that you wanted to ask Patrisse.
Thank you so much for your time. And Minty, thank you for your time too. Minty actually, COVID has been, it was rough on her the first several months. And it's I haven't physically seen her in a long time, and Minty means a lot to me. So it's good every opportunity I get to see you. It's nice to see your smile, Minty. So let me, before I get to the question from Converge, and Converge Media is it's a brother named Omari up here, and he's a really, really good dude. And he has really pushed the truth as far as trying to give an alternative perspective to all the really, really demonizing images of the protesters here in Seattle. People would say, well, this is them doing some horrible, horrible thing, killing cats and smashing dogs and pushing old ladies down when they're walking crossing the street. And Omari would come with the images. No, this is actually what happened. Let me give you a little context. And he's been doing that very, very prolifically, and it's incredibly important work because we're talking about storytellers. And his storytelling ability, his genius, and the brilliance that he's provided has been correcting the record, giving a much bigger record than what we're getting through mainstream media. His question, and so I say all that to say I trust his questions. And it's important to me that that he asks these questions when we're given the opportunity to talk to a masterful storyteller such as you, Patrisse. And his question was that it seems as though BLM is everywhere. And it says, was the organization able to verify these groups that claim they're BLM in communities, or are they affiliated with the organization? And is it similar to the national process for BLM? Is it one big umbrella? Is it a lot of people with their own agency to utilize the name and mission as they see fit? Is there centralization of mission? That sort of thought, Patrisse.
Sure. There is. People have to remember that the organization, the Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation, shares the same name as the movement, which is Black Lives Matter. And when we developed the chapter-based network, never did I imagine that people would pretend to be chapters or just use the name without getting permission or start their own organization with the name of Black Lives Matter. We didn't trademark it. And that's both a blessing and a curse. Black Lives Matter is public domain. It is not owned by anyone, even though we coined the term. And I think it's good on the one hand. Our job was not to own the movement. I think where it gets tricky is when you get people like, the brother in Santa Clarita who started the Black Lives Matter Foundation and raised $2 million because corporations were so, desperate to give money that they weren't verifying who was who. And this dude's talking about having coffee with the cops, and then, or like individuals who are deciding to start Black Lives Matter organizations in their own neighborhoods, even though we've said, hey, can you talk to the leadership first of Black Lives Matter? I think a lot of this has a lot to do with sexism and us being 3 Black women and sort of the kind of disrespect that we've experienced. I don't think would have happened if it was 3 Black men. I know it wouldn't have happened. The idea that there are people in this moment of Black Lives Matter who had no idea who we were. In our movement, people know who we are, but we weren't mainstream until this moment. And that would have never happened if Black men started Black Lives Matter. I met some people this time around who apologized to me, Black men, in the hip hop community that were like, I'm sorry, I didn't really believe that Black women started Black Lives Matter. Either they thought that we were there was like a puppet behind us, or it was Black men who started it. So I think there has everything to do with so many different isms and barriers for people to just be like, oh, let me respect where respect is due. And then also, we made it really clear that this was a decentralized movement. Never did we say that there was a single leader. We said this was a leaderful movement. And I think that has both been amazing for people and it's also confused people. So that doesn't give you like a direct answer to that question. But all that to say is that there are lots of people who call themselves Black Lives Matter that are not affiliated with the Black Lives Matter Global Network Foundation, with the actual organization. Tons of people who call themselves Black Lives Matter activists that are centering themselves versus, you know, Black people in the movement. And then there's people who, you know, kind of like jumped on the Black Lives Matter Black bandwagon and was like, I'm going to use this term because I know it'll give me more clout in certain spaces. Some people use it and they're not a part of the global network, but they're still amazing organizers. So it's like it can be confusing. And I thought we were special. We're not, because the Panthers, if you talk to the Panthers, they say they experience the same thing. You know, there'd be Panther chapters in places that they'd be like, those are not the Panthers. Like, that's not us. But we grew exponentially more than we realize and more than we could sustain. And that's beautiful and also creates its challenges.
Just as a follow-up, it creates challenges. You use the word challenges, and I think that was a very specific word. But what, like the brother in, when you say Santa Clarita, did you say? Do you seek recourse against people or organizations that are doing things that are outside the mission of Black Lives Matter?
We have in the past. We have done a lot of that work. It's pretty exhausting. There was someone who was going around like in 2015, 2016, saying he was the president and CEO of Black Lives Matter, getting on CNN and everything. And we definitely shut that down. But in the most recent phase, like, we haven't had to do as much of that because, you know, the co-founders have become a kind of popular that we can say, hey, that's not us, and people get it. But yeah, we definitely have. We have historically, you know, checked people and also had conversations, and sometimes that worked and sometimes it didn't.
So, obviously we could sit here for another 3 hours and talk. I guess I'm curious, within the next, I don't know, until November the 4th, give us 3 pieces of advice for people, regardless, BIPOC or otherwise, 3 pieces of advice for how we need to be showing up with some intentionality until November the 4th.
Sure. Number one, everybody should be paying attention to what's happening with the U.S. Postal Service. And so that looks like spreading the news that it's under attack and it's being underfunded, and that this government is trying to rig an election. So I think lots of people, I don't think many of us knew how important the U.S. Postal Service was. And so I think it's an incredibly important campaign to work on. With that, buy stamps. I don't know if people know, but the U.S. Postal Service does not receive any tax dollars, even though it's a governmental agency. It's like run as a business, and so it needs money right now. So we should buy stamps. I think now is the time to have the kinds of courageous conversations that we had on this podcast. Now is the time to talk about anti-Black racism and how it impacts you, your family, your community, and really show up in that rigor. And number 3, like, enjoy yourself. I really feel like, especially as activists and organizers, sometimes we could take ourselves too seriously. And so I think this is an opportunity to like find the way that, especially in COVID-19, like the isolation can just get to you. Like find something that you love and that you enjoy, and lean into that and lean into joy right now.
Beautiful, beautiful. If you ever want to come on again, please do not, whenever you want. And we'll talk about all the fascinating things in the world. Just Ross, I want to thank you for checking in and taking care of me the last 5.5 months of this craziness that I'm experiencing and everybody else is experiencing. But since I'm centering myself in this moment, thank you for checking on me. Feel free to send some fish here my way. I'm out of smoked fish.
I got you.
Yay.
Thank you so much, Patrisse. Thank you, Minta. I love both of you. I'm not using it in the sense that people, you know, I truly love
Hollywood love. I love you.
I truly love both of you. I admire both of you. I'm so proud to be affiliated in any way with both of you. Thank you for everything you do.
Thanks, y'all. Big hugs. This was so special. Thank you, team.
Thank you, Patrisse. Have a good one, y'all.
Okay, bye.